Well, hey there, and welcome to Grace Church. We are so glad you are joining us. And if this is your first time checking out Grace, special welcome to you. My name is Joel, and we want you to know that you belong, and we would love to connect you to what's going on here at Grace Church. And the easiest way to do that is visiting our website or our app. All things fall are on there and what's happening. Joining a life group and how to do that is on there. We have something called Discovery and getting connected to that is on there. We have student and kid things happening on a weekly basis. So check it out. It'd be worth your time. And also, we'd invite you to join us on a Sunday morning at 10:30 in person for our service. We'd love to have you in Barberton with us, have some coffee, meet some new people, sing with us, study God's Word with us, and we would have a great time together. Also, your kids, 0 to 5th grade, are welcome. We have Power Kids programming that they would enjoy, meet some new friends, get to know about Jesus, and have an absolute blast. And so we invite you to join us that way. Let us know if you have any questions. We are in the last phase of our series, Life with Each Other. Romans 13 is where we're going to be at. Why don't you turn there and we'll get started. Said we're jumping into week 5 of Life with Each Other. Hope that you've enjoyed the series and gathered a lot from it. Hope it's challenged you as well as encouraged you, maybe equipped you, and kind of moved you forward in your fellowship to Jesus. Let me say this, we're really excited right now at Grace about what God's doing in our kids and student ministries. And so if you have a kiddo all the way from 0 to 12th grade who maybe isn't involved in our kids or student ministry, we would invite you to check out what's going on there. Bringing your student, bringing your kid. Sunday morning, all of our Power Kids stuff happens, and we have resources to let you continue the conversation throughout the week with them. On Wednesday nights, our students hang out from 6:30 to 8:30 at the building. And it's a great time for students to have fun together, get to know each other, and they get into God's Word together. And so they are actively studying the Bible, walking through Mark right now. And so all that information is online on our website. And if you do have any questions or want your student to get connected, hey, just let us know. We'd love to have that conversation with you. And we have some great leaders in that realm. Xavier is leading in our student realm. We have a bunch of volunteers throughout both realms that would love to hang out with your kids. We are excited in this series. We've been talking about what it looks like to do life with each other. And I don't know about you, but life with each other, at least in my world, can get messy, it can get hard, it can get complicated, and it can be a lot of fun, and it can be a joy, and it can be really, 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 really just life-giving in a lot of ways. But as you walk through life, there's seasons, there's moments, there's challenges to it all. And so that's why we're doing this series. As we walk into the fall, as school starts, as a rhythm starts, right, you start to figure out who you're doing life with and how life with each other is being played out. And I thought this series would just be great as we introduce not only a new season, a new rhythm, but also as we start life groups in our kind of environment of Grace Church. And so if you're not a part of a life group, check those out on our website. Those are fantastic ways to get connected to people and really dive into life with each other. In the first 4 weeks, we've looked at Romans 12, and we've looked at the concept of life with each other underneath the umbrella of what we'll talk about today a little bit more of, underneath the umbrella of the mercy of God, the good news of Jesus, really, and how that redeems our understanding of life with each other, how that pushes us forward, and how that defines it for us. And so today is exactly the same way. We are going to look at the gospel, the good news of Jesus, how it informs a very specific arena of life with each other. Because here's the reality. Life with each other always includes authority. Okay? It always includes at least some sort of conversation that way, whether directly or indirectly, right? we live in a world, we live in a universe, right? We live in maybe even a time where authority, right, is very present in our lives in so many different ways. And Paul starts in Romans 13. He says this, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, right? And that's where we're going to go today, okay? And I recognize, right, this may not be a popular conversation. I also recognize that this is a healthy conversation to have. I recognize that not everybody sits in the same tank in this conversation. And I recognize that life with each other, right, provides all sorts of different experiences, this being one of them. And yet, in light of that, Paul goes from Romans 12 into Romans 13. And in the first century when Paul wrote this, there weren't chapters, okay? We kind of created that through our translations and stuff. So he was coming from that Romans 12 kind of verse and passages right into Romans 13. And so I think in some ways he intentionally did this to connect them, right? I think Romans 14 is like that, even some of 15, right? And he closes out in 16. But Paul does this very intentionally. And I think he does this very intentionally because life with each other, right, has a lot of facets to the conversations, authority being one, right? You and I do life with each other, right? Either under authority or we're working together inside of that paradigm, or maybe we're both in leadership and all those things, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics to it. But I would say this, where we need to start is recognizing that it's really easy inside of this conversation and authorities overall, it's really easy as a human being to buck authority, is it not? Right? There's something like built in me. I felt this a lot during high school, right? That I wanted to push against authority. I remember when I was a sophomore, I had a teacher who not many in my class liked, okay? So it was one of those teachers, right? The reality is we decided to, instead of maybe listening to everything or participating in anything, we decided to goof around in her class a lot, right? And try not to get caught. And so I remember one of the games that we would do, I had 4 buddies in that class with me, right? Which is never a good sign, right? And so we like to have fun together. And we sat next to each other, pretty close to each other. And what happened is we started to kind of goof around we had a paper ball that we kind of rolled up and we'd throw it to each other, right? And so we did that for a while when her back was turned, right? I'm not suggesting this is a good idea, nor am I promoting this, but I'm just saying what we did, right? And we started throwing that around. Well, eventually she caught on, right? Eventually she caught on. And what she did was she literally put me and my friends in 4 different corners of the seating, right? So I was up here, buddy was back here, another buddy was over here, another buddy was over here, right? And to prevent us from messing around and laughing and goofing off, right? And what happened is we continued by smashing up that paper into a ball, throwing it around the room, right? We would just throw it longer distances. And I remember there was one day in particular where she had happened to turn around when one of my buddies was throwing this paper ball, right? And inevitably, like it was, not just him, it was all of us, but he's the one that got in trouble, right? I remember thinking to myself, oh man, I can't believe that he got caught. I can't believe this. I can't believe that. Why would she do this, right? It was just easy because as I walked through high school and as I gained a little bit more freedom as I got older, for some reason there was something inside of me that said, I want to do this. I want to push against authority in some way. And one of my favorite authors, Paul Tripp, he says this, and he's giving us a scope of the biblical story, how the gospel kind of plays out in this. He would say this, you could argue that the biblical story is an authority story. It starts with a rebellion against authority, and it marches to a moment where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. What he is saying is ultimately this, that this idea of Paul writing in Romans 13, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, is not just a horizontal thing we have to deal with. It actually is a scope of the biblical worldview and biblical story that we hold, and really is redeemed through the gospel and what Jesus says. That ultimately what Jesus did was he came and he was proclaiming that he is Lord, he is God in the flesh, he is King of the universe, and he has come to save us. And that in doing that, when we recognize those things, right, and come to Jesus, we're recognizing recognizing that he is Lord, right? And there will be a day where everybody recognizes that, but we have the chance to say yes to him here. And really where this whole story starts is Genesis 3:1, right? You see the serpent, he says this to the woman after, Adam and Eve are created. It's all good. And God sends them to go rule over and to be over in partnership with his working, right? And we see the serpent kind of come in. This is what he says. Says to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Right? What's happening here? The temptation that Satan is throwing in is to question and reposition authority into our own hands. Right? Here's the reality that our nature to buck authority is not just because I don't like that guy, or I don't like that lady, or I don't like that team, or I don't like that side. It's kind of spiritually a thing we wrestle with too. And it started with this temptation in the garden. And there's a guy by the name of John Mark Comer who has a great book, and he would say this, that those lies, those temptations, right, they're a deceptive idea. They're a deceptive idea that Satan kind of throws in that plays into our disordered desires, which is normalized in a fallen world, okay? So basically in this scenario, did God really say that, right? It leads into disordered desires, right? Me and you are made in God's image, and we are invited to partner with him in ruling over this earth. And yet, right, in that disorderedness, we kind of claim authority of our own life when we don't really have that. And in a fallen world, we're encouraged to run into that, right? And he would say this, that Genesis 3, the lie there, is the lie behind all lies. The deception, or really temptation, is and has always been twofold: to seize autonomy from God and to redefine good and evil based on the voice in our heads and the inclination of our hearts, rather than trust in the loving word of God. That this authority thing is not just something that just recently is a conversation. It always has been a conversation. It's always been a conversation, first vertically, then horizontally. Because by questioning, right, that we see here in the garden, we quickly become our own authority. The evil one deceives us into believing that we are. And our human desires are distorted into believing I should be the authority in my life, right? And the world around us would say, you do you, right? You pursue that. And in our rebellion or our disrespect of human authority, it's actually a direct result of our rebellion of God's authority in the garden. That whenever we push against, right, me throwing a paper ball in my science teacher's class, right, it is something that's not just in that moment. It's something that innately, through the temptation or the deception of sin, right, is built into me. And it's something that started and is directly resulting in the rebellion that happened in the garden. And so as we do life with each other, right, we're not directly going in all these areas. We're going to specifically talk about governing authorities, like the government, right? Those that are over us, maybe in a political or social way, right? That are authorities in our life. But I want to start here. Like, as we do life for each other, am I respecting my parents, right? If you're a kid, or maybe you're an adult, but your parents are still living, respecting them? Are you honoring them? Are you listening to God in how you interact with them, and also letting him lead you in that, right? Are you respecting your boss, right? Are you respecting your boss who you go into work every day, in and day out, right? Respecting and honoring them, and ultimately letting God lead you in that? Are you respecting government officials, right? And that's what we'll talk about today. Are we respecting police, fire, first responders? And then am I respecting those that are in ultimate kind of overarching authority, like the presidents, right? Are we respecting those that are governors, mayors, those that have authority over different segments of our life? Because here's what I believe, and then we'll kind of dive into some questions, that authority in life is a signpost of God's grace, mercy, and sovereignty. That's what we'll see in Romans 13. The authority in life, right, human authority, is a signpost of God's grace, mercy, and sovereignty. And I think Paul introduces this concept in Romans 12. He says this, Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And ultimately, you'll be able to test that, right? And know what God's will is in that. When I renew my mind in the mercy of God, the Spirit of God transforms my life into a person of God, worshiping by laying down my life. That as I renew my mind in the mercy of God, the good news of Jesus, the Spirit of God transforms my life into a person of God that worships Him and ultimately glorifies Him through laying down my life to Him and towards others. And Paul invites us to live based on the mercy of God by laying down my life, emptying myself, filling myself up with Him to live for others, even those who are in authority of me. So Paul then transitions to Romans 13. Right? That ultimately this horizontal human authority that we live life with and we do life together with, right? There's a very specific way that we interact with them, right? And Paul biblically is going to wrestle with this in light of the gospel. And then we're going to talk about maybe some contextual ways that that plays out for us here in our own context, 21st century, 2022, right? So Romans 13, verse 1 through 5. This is where Paul goes, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Right? What's Paul saying? Well, I think we got to understand the context first here, okay? So we're going to just run through the context briefly. And I think there's two things to kind of note about the context, okay? Because Paul's context is very, very unique. The Roman government is the powerhouse of the day when Paul is writing this. They oversee a lot of different countries and land, and their government has kind of seeped into and taken ownership over a lot of different pieces of territory, including Israel and including Jerusalem, right? And so there's ultimately this clash of Jewish people and Roman authority, right? And Paul's kind of writing in the midst of this, and he's writing to the church in Rome, who are followers of Christ and are Gentiles and Jews and have a lot of different cultural backgrounds. And the government, right, in place there, overarching there, right, is ruling. And he's writing to a group of people that probably would have disagreed with a lot of things that they did and probably would have looked at the Roman government poorly, really. They would have been persecuted by the Roman government. They would have been suffering by them. They wouldn't agree with a lot of decisions. The Roman government was a very ungodly, was a very pagan kind of center of the day and really didn't pursue Jesus. And so Paul, I think he's writing to two things going on. First is to note this, that Paul, I think in light of this chapter, he's writing using this conversation as a way to speak against the zealot Jewish revolt of the Roman authorities. That there were Jews kind of who had a lot of zeal to come up against the Roman government and to do in a way that would be revolts or riots or violence or things of that nature. And Paul, he's kind of speaking to these people and saying, no, that's not the response. We see after Paul's death in AD 70, that actually did happen, and it didn't go well for them. The Roman government smacked them, smushed them, right? The temple was burned down, right? It didn't go well at all, and it didn't give to anything taking place, and it didn't give to Jesus being glorified, right? And so Paul is kind of using chapter 13, not directly maybe, but indirectly, kind of speaking to those groups that would choose a very specific way of going up against this, but also I think what's interesting is that he's not only talking to that group, but he's also kind of writing this in light of the conversation or context they're living under, right? And here's the reality. Paul recognizes that he's not just writing to encourage the church, but he's also writing in a context that is very hard and there's a lot of persecution. That the context Paul's writing in, like I said, is this Roman government with Roman emperors that would have been seated on the throne, making decisions and ruling, and they would have been ungodly rulers. They would have been immoral rulers. They would have not had the sight of Jesus in their line. And so some of the people that they would have seen, some of the guys that would have been ruling during the Church of Rome's time and during Paul's time would have been something like this. Caligula, who was the ruler of Rome in 37 to 41 AD, right? Some things that he did, which would show you kind of the intensity of what they're living in. He had his mom and brother killed to make sure that they didn't challenge the throne. Okay, so that's one way to do it. I don't know, maybe there's other ways, right? He openly committed incest with his 3 sisters. Frequently, he would cross-dress and go out in public. He instilled his favorite horse as senator and promoted him, right? And he removed heads of gods and statues to put his own head on there. And we see on and on that goes with him, right? Can you imagine, right? Can you imagine living inside of that setting and being a follower of Christ, navigating all of those things? Claudius was next. What happened is he had some of his own family killed, right? Which was ruthlessly his own right and his own decision to do, right? His regime was very cruel and crazy. He ruled from 41 to 54 AD. Nero was next, right? And Nero, his mom killed Claudius in his sleep so that Nero could replace him, right? He turns out to be actually the one that was the cruelest towards Christians, set Rome on fire, and then it was kind of this rumor that maybe Nero set Rome on fire, and instead of owning up to it, he blamed Christians publicly, that they were the ones responsible for it. And a string of persecutions and suffering kind of followed towards the church and towards Christians, right? It's even said that he kicked his pregnant wife to death. It's said that he took Christians, tortured them, persecuted them, even stuck them onto poles and lit them on fire to be used as lanterns. Most likely, this is the emperor that put Paul to death and beheaded him, right? And this is interesting because I think, as we talk about the setting and context that Paul's sitting in, he's navigating these conversations equally, where he's trying to lead his followers, those that he's leading in the church, and saying, how do you navigate kind of governing authorities and respecting and honoring and ultimately kind of coming under them, right? And ultimately sitting underneath of maybe their leadership with where you live. But also he's going to speak to the reality that not every situation is perfect, golden, and awesome. Not every leader is a Christian. Not every leader is a follower of Christ, right? There are often times where that's not the case, and there are immoral things happening. There's ungodly things happening. There's unjust things happening. There's unmerciful things happening. And how do you navigate that, right? And I think this is what makes maybe the last 3 years here in our context really hard. It saddens my heart, the political rhetoric that has taken place over the last 3 years. Because as we look at what has taken place the last 3 years, right, as followers of Christ, Paul is going to encourage us to live in such a way. And contextually, we have a lot more freedoms than the church that he's writing to in Rome does, and yet allowing those things to ultimately point us to Jesus, but ultimately point others to Jesus in the process. Whether it's social media, news channels, right side, left side, right? I fear that we have taken a stance as followers of Christ, I'm talking to followers of Christ in particular. There's many followers of Christ that have taken the stance of my team winning instead of winning them to Christ. That I'm going to scream instead of crying out to God for people's salvation. And in that, I think that what has happened is, right, we have chosen a path that doesn't look at all like Jesus. And as we hold these things that are dichotomically in hand, right, there's a tension there. Unjust rulers, right? Not always perfect systems. but how do we interact with that as followers of Christ, right? Even when the system or the ruler is great and we're along for the ride, right? How do we interact as followers of Christ? And the reality is what Paul's writing to, I think, crosses contextual barriers, crosses even cultural barriers, right? To say that no matter who's in the seat as president, who's in the seat as governor, who's in the seat as mayor, who's in the seat of emperor, I want you to be able to do these things as a follower of Christ. Because the reality is, there will be unjust rulers. There will be, right, people that come into play that are up against followers of Christ. That's what we see in Rome. And ultimately, Peter speaks in this, 1 Peter 2:18. This is what he says, slaves, so he's talking to those, right, who would have had an owner or a master who would have been working, right, out their debts. In reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh, right? In the same way, as if they were good or maybe even on our team, we should respect or submit or serve them, right? And here's the reality, right? We don't need to follow them as our leader in the sense of we're going to do everything they're going to do, or we agree with everything they're going to say, or we have the same opinion as them. But there comes a respect and an honoring as a follower of Christ. Now, where that comes up against, right, and this is where the disclaimer is, where that kind of comes up against things, right, is when it's in direct opposition of the will of God. And ultimately, inside of that, right, we have the freedom to say, as followers of Christ, that we're not going to go that direction, right? Or that we're not going to follow in that way, right? And in particular in our country, right, as a democracy, we have different options, right? And when something that, whether it's a law or whether it's something comes up that as followers of Christ that goes against the will of God and maybe the biblical authority of God and all of those things, right? There's ways that we can voice ourselves in respectful and honoring ways, not verbally abusing anybody in that, but ultimately standing up for what we believe is right? And there's ways to do that in respectful ways. There's ways to just kind of dismiss and not go about doing what is being done, right? And saying, I'm going to live this way and not that way. But what we see ultimately taking place here in Rome is maybe the third thing is when that happens, right? There's unjust rulers and there's things being asked of Christians that goes against the will of God. Sometimes it leads to persecution, right? We see that in Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? We see Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, bow down to the golden statue. They're like, no, right? Sometimes you got to stand up, right? Sometimes there is this kind of forceful, do this, you got to stand up. And they said no, and they were thrown in the fiery furnace, and God saved them from that. And Nebuchadnezzar kind of came around to understanding who God is. And the reality is this, it can be hard to live life with each other under authority, next to authority, or even being the one in authority. And there's a lot of different scenarios that play out. And we're just going to look at like two things real briefly that Paul kind of strings out here in Romans 13. The first is this. Do I see human authority as established by God, right? Do I see human authority as established by God? Paul Tripp would say this, you cannot separate the sovereign authority of God from the exercise of human authority that is alien to the biblical worldview. God has placed visible authority on this earth through imperfect human beings, right? That God knows who's going to be placed in authority, knows what kingdoms are going to be placed in authority, knows what rulers and leaders are going to be placed in authority, and sovereignly carries that out, right? And there is a lot of discussion, right? There's going to be a lot of conversation around, well, just versus unjust nations or rulers, right? Harsh versus not harsh, godly versus ungodly, right? And yet God sovereignly is over all. And it gives us a perspective whether we sit inside of a godly or ungodly leadership, whether we sit in a nation that is godly or ungodly, right, following Jesus or not. It gives us perspective because your boss, right, sovereignly established by God. Our mayor, sovereignly established by God. Our governor, sovereignly established by God. Police officers, sovereignly established by God. The president, sovereignly established by God. That the seat that they hold of authority, right? God knew that they were going to sit in it, knew that it was going to take place, and is working out authority through each of those places, right? And I think what Paul might be getting at here is this, is that when we recognize the sovereign authority of God playing out in the seats of human authority, or the seats of those authority positions, right? Even though imperfect, I think the question you would ask is this: am I being an armchair authority, or am I being a cheerleader for my authorities? Right? Am I being an armchair authority or a cheerleader for my authorities? And here's why I think that he would ask that, right? Is because it's really easy. It's really easy when you're not in that position to sit in the lazy boy and call out what should be done. Instead of saying, how can I encourage, respectfully honoring, even if I disagree with them on some things, how can I encourage them in other ways? How can I be praying for them, which we'll get to, right? Because ultimately, God has established authority on this earth by his grace and mercy and sovereignty. It's for my protection, right? Can you imagine if there was no laws, there was no authority over our world, over our country, over our homes, over just kind of individually things taking place, right? And authorities, right, have put so much in place that are good for us to process and think about, right? The mundane things about traffic, right? How traffic works in our cities, right? To speed limits and all of those things. But the reality is, if there was none of that, there was no laws, there was no anything taking place, right? No authority underneath everything. In theory, it sounds great, right? It's like anti-authority, right? We want to be free. But in no authority or no kind of system in place, it would not be freeing. It would be restrictive, be chaotic. That ultimately would just be me against you. And I can tell you this, if there was no authority in place sovereignly given to by God, nobody would be on this earth to this day, because I think we'd finish each other off by now. That we wouldn't even know what to do. That their authority on this earth is gracious and merciful and is sovereign, because it kind of saves me from myself. That it ultimately, the goal is, right, but it's imperfect, and because we live in a fallen world, it's not done all the time, and a lot of times it's not done, but imperfectly, the goal is that human authority is playing out godliness, is playing out laws that give to the biblical nature of who God is and what God desires, right? And there is some of that to protect us, to make sure punishment is exacted upon things that take place that are evil or not good. I think what's beautiful is God's laws in the Bible, biblically, make visible his grace, right? We see that in Leviticus. You read through Leviticus, as exhausting and boring as it can be, don't start in Leviticus, right? Read through a lot of other things, and then Leviticus will make sense. I just got done reading through Leviticus. It was beautiful, because I read through it and I was like, this makes sense. God is giving us these things to free us through his grace, to grace us. He's telling us not to do certain things because he knows that life will be lived in such a way more beautifully by not doing those things. Or he's telling us to do certain things because inside of that, I get to experience his grace more and life freer, right? And human authority, right, is in place to protect us from ourselves. And human authority is given to protect, and I say punish because of the alliteration, right? Or correct, or to make right. That what we see happen is this, that there are laws in place to give to the human flourishing, right? But not every law would we agree with, right? There's good, there's bad, and then there's just weird laws. And so I thought, in the midst of this conversation, there's just some weird laws that I'm not sure, right? Someone was high on something or had too much to drink, right? There's some weird laws. So let's just have some fun with this in betwixt all of this craziness, right? In Chesapeake City, Virginia, if you're over 14 years old, you cannot trick or treat, okay? So don't go to Virginia expecting to trick or treat. You can't wash your neighbor's car without permission in Los Angeles, so don't go to LA, right, and wash people's cars. It's illegal to drive while your dog is tethered to your car in Alaska, right? I'd assume that should be illegal everywhere, but I guess it's not. You can't drive a car in reverse in public roads in Arizona, right? And it's illegal to run out of gas in Youngstown, Ohio. Note that. So if you run out of gas in Youngstown, ain't no one gonna help you because I don't want to be caught trying to help someone there in an illegal state, right? But here's the reality, right? We have these laws to protect, punish, and human authority is imperfect, so it's messy sometimes. The goal is to grace us with freedom to live life and to enjoy life and to be protected in this life and to ultimately relationally get along in this life by these things. And what's interesting is this, is Paul is saying that seat is given by the sovereignty of God. That when we see something play out in healthy ways, right? When police are doing their jobs, the mayor, the president doing their job, and they're doing it, we should encourage, and we should be encouraged that that is playing out. Because here's the reality. Paul refers to governing authorities as servants and ministers of God. You're like, what? Why? What? Right? You're like, I'm not sure I agree with that, right? Well, here's reality. Is that always seen by the person that's in authority? No. But should I always see that? Yes. Because here's reality. That concept is preparing me for eternity, where I'll be under God's perfect authority for the rest of eternity. It doesn't mean that certain situations doesn't give to me as a follower of Christ saying yes to God, right? If it's biblically against God's will, right? But at the same time, God has given seats of authority to humans to ultimately be respected and honored as his servants and ministers, whether they see that or not. So next time you get pulled over for going over the speed limit, right? You should sit in your car and think, this is by the grace of God, so that I am not going to danger other people, right? Or hurt myself. And that police officer that comes up, right, is a servant of God protecting those around you, right? And to think about how that changes your dialogue with someone in authority. And so I need to see, first and foremost, human authority is not this thing that we came up with. It's something God came up with, put inside of his plan, right, of creation, of the church, of all these things, right? But in governing authorities, that's included. Right? There's a lot of scholars that derive Genesis, I believe it's 6, or somewhere in that Noah kind of time frame, right? That we see that start to play out. And so ultimately, we need to see human authority is something God ordained. But secondly, and then we'll get into some action points, do I see human authority deserves submission from me? Paul uses similar language in Romans 12, 1 through 2. And throughout his letters, right? We see as a living sacrifice, but we also see that Paul writes, submit to one another, submit to Jesus, submit to your spouse, Ephesians 5, right? All that comes. Why? Because laying down your life, submitting, serving is demonstrating worship to our God. And what he is not saying is just be a yes man. No. But what he's saying is ultimately in doing this, and as I serve and as I respect and as I care for and as I pray for, right, ultimately it can change the dynamics of how I view authority in my life on all levels, right? And this, I would say, is submitting to human authority if it does not go against God's will. And that takes a lot of understanding, wisdom, and time with Jesus to know when and when not to lean into that. And how do we do that well? I think Paul mentions some things, okay? So we're just going to fly through this. But the first thing that Paul mentions in verse 6 is paying taxes. You're like, great, right? We went there. Yeah, this is what Paul says in verse 6. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing, right? There's a reality that our taxes is a way to respect and honor those in authority, right? There's income that comes based off of that. There's things that the government or the systems of our cities can do because of that to add to protecting and add to putting the right things into place, right? And ultimately, by paying taxes, it is one of the most respectful things and honoring things. It's a visibly respectable thing, right? If you're being chased down because you didn't pay your taxes, right? That's the thing Paul goes back to, right? If you want to have good relationships with those in authority, do what is good, not what is evil, right? Because what is evil deserves punishment, and those that are in authority have every right to punish and to play that out, right? And what good is it as a follower of Christ to be in that seat when rather we could demonstrate respect by doing this, right? We see even Jesus interact with this conversation. Matthew 22, this is what he says to those questioning, hey, should we pay our taxes or not? He says this, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, right? That is so important to understand. That Jesus wasn't trying to fight this fight of taking over this kind of social construct. He wanted to ultimately gather us and gather our hearts and take a hold of our hearts really for his kingdom. And paying taxes in this life is a way that he is calling us to respect and honor those that are sitting in seats of authority, right? And here's the reality. Just as much as I give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Am I rendering or giving back to God what is God's? Like the question goes back. Before I think the question maybe is asked wrong, right? What do I give to Caesar, right? Well, here's reality. The question should be, how am I also giving back to God? And what are those things looking like? Instead of just being against these things, am I living in such a way that's over here too? Secondly is this. I think that Paul would encourage us to participate, right? And the reality is it's not a bad thing to participate inside of governing authorities or governments or those things. Actually, it should be encouraged. I was talking to a friend of mine, buddy, that's in Pennsylvania. He's gotten into that full time. That is his profession. And I'm like, good for you. Followers of Christ need to be in every profession, right? This is what Paul would say in verse 7. He'd say, give to everyone what is owed them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If you have revenue, then revenue, right? Paying taxes, all that stuff. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor, right? That ultimately it is a participatory kind of system that we can play into as followers of Christ to respect and honor and be a part of, right? That goes outside of just paying taxes. That for some of us, we're called to be in that field. For some of us, we're called to sit in that seat. For some of us, we're called to be a part of the local politics of things and to guide our community. Maybe it's even school board-esque, right? We have the opportunity to vote, right? Participate that way. When elections come up, right? That you should be aware of that and you should participate in that, right? That is something that a lot of people have died for and served for our freedom to be able to do, right? We should participate in those things, right? We should support people. And I think that even on the flip side, when we are living inside of maybe persecution, right? Or those things, we participate in God's will, but we do it in a way that isn't to the detriment of others. In supporting, am I respecting, right? And I think that is a key thing. That we should have a tone about ourselves, a civility about ourselves inside of these conversations that give to people not questioning if we are followers of Christ or not. That shouldn't question our actions is it contrast to the Bible, right? That is happening. The last 3 years, that has happened, right? Where people have put up what people have said as professing followers of Christ to what the Bible says, and it's in contradiction. And that's such a shame that we should promote right and pursue respect in the midst of it. So you and I can promote Christly ways or Christ-likeness or promote things that would be honoring to God and biblically honoring, and yet respect people even in the differences and respect those, right, that maybe are standing up against us. Second thing is this, pray, right? I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but the question I'm asking is how many of us are praying for our governing officials, even if they're not on our team, right? Because that seed has been placed, it's been ordained, or it's been given by God's sovereignty. And so I need to pray for them because they sit in a seat that's not easy. Right? I think about the seat of president, the seat of mayor, the seat of governor, no matter who's in the seat, right? Those are really heavy seats, weighty seats. Any seat of leadership has weight to it, responsibility, all the way down to parents, right? Are we praying for them, even if we don't agree with them? Fourth, let love lead, right? Paul would say this in verse 8 through 10, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Commandments: don't commit adultery, murder, steal, covet. Whatever command there may be are summed up in one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is the fulfillment of the law. The law can never be met perfectly by me. That is why Jesus came. He fulfilled the law perfectly. And in fulfilling that law, he saved us, and he motivates us to love others. And by living that perfect life, being the perfect spotless sacrifice and defeating evil. He fulfilled it, gave us understanding of it, right? We need to be distinct in this, that our love should lead us, right? This quote, it's not on the screen, but our public witness as Christians should make people say, look at the power of their love, not look at how much they love power, right? We shouldn't be out there seeking power and seeking the seat, right? But how we love through it, whether we're in the seat, our team's in the seat or not, right? Russell Moore would say this: a church that loses its distinctiveness is a church that has nothing distinctive with which to engage the culture. A worldly church is no good to the world. That's key. Our love is our distinctiveness. And if our love is not distinct, if it doesn't look any different than the culture or any different than the world around us, then we might as well close churches because it ain't worth it. We're doing it wrong, right? That love crosses barriers and boundaries, that agape love holds grace and truth equally in hand, that love has compassion and courage to run into. And love, right? Love is something that God first gave us and we live out of. And if we want to fulfill the law, if we want to fulfill doing good, it is loving our neighbor as ourselves that fulfills all of this. Now, lastly, how do we engage with this? In particular with those, when we live in situations where unjust or ungodly or immoral countries are in play, right? And I would say that we live in a country that has a lot of messed up things. We are far from being a godly, moral country, and a lot of countries are the same, right? Human beings. The reality is this: as followers of Christ, our primary identity needs to be in our eternal home, in our eternal identity as Christ's followers, which dictates ultimately how we lead. That's why I would say clothe yourself with Jesus is the primary thing. Russell Moore, he says this in his book, "We will be Americans best when we are not Americans first." The reality, what he's saying there is we will be the best kind of version of ourselves, the best version of an American if our first identity is followers of Christ. This is where Paul goes. Let's behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, in sexual immorality, debauchery, or dissension, jealousy. Rather, clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ. Do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. Here's the reality. Jesus came to start a spiritual revolution, not a social revolution. That Jesus came, and yes, he could have addressed a lot of different messy stuff, and yet he wanted our hearts. And in that, in capturing our hearts, it would flood out into social things changing. And when we clothe ourselves with Jesus, we live by the light. The light helps us navigate with truth and grace this reality. And if I put on Jesus every day, transforming my heart, the Spirit will, and it will lead me not to gratify the things of the world. And so when ultimately I'm sitting in that seat, clothing myself with Jesus, sitting in the mercy and the love of God, I need to do that every day ultimately to live out of my eternal identity, not just my momentary one. That decisions will be made and I will have wisdom to navigate the situations at hand because I deeply, deeply, deeply want followers of Christ to not just want their team to win, but to win people to Christ. Not just scream at the other team, but to cry out to God for those who have different opinions or different viewpoints. And we will not get to that point until we clothe ourselves with Jesus. And that is the truth of the matter. Father, we thank you so much for who you are and all that you do. Thank you for this conversation. Lead us, guide us, give us your grace and mercy. Help us understand how to respect and how to guide our own thinking, and at the same time navigate the hard situations of life that is messy and hard with each other. And so, Father, we are grateful for you. We praise you and love you. Praise your name. Amen. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we will see you next time.